Imagine for a second trying to debate someone who isn't actually thinking, but they're merely running a pre-programmed script.
Like a human algorithm.
Right, exactly. Like a human video game algorithm that just loops the exact same defensive dialogue, no matter what evidence you actually present them with.
It's wild to think about.
It really is. And today we are unpacking a manifesto that claims this isn't some, dystopian science fiction concept, but the exact engineered reality of modern politics.
Yeah, and it goes deep, really deep.
It does. And I want to speak directly to you right now, the listener, especially if you are a men's rights activist, or, if you're engaged with the red-pilled manosphere, or honestly, if you're just a man trying to make sense of a world that increasingly seems hostile to your very nature.
Because today's deep dive is tailored specifically for you.
Exactly. It's an ultra-long, incisive, and, truly fascinating exploration. We are going to provide a roadmap to understanding the history of Western institutions before they were, as our source material argues, completely captured by feminists and Marxists.
It's basically a complete historical autopsy.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. But before we get into this massive analysis, please take a second to like and subscribe to the show right now so you never miss these extensive deep dives.
You're going to want to stick around for this one, trust me.
Definitely. So today we are reviewing a digital ebook titled Wild Geese, The Archetype of Irish Exile and the Return to Rational Order. It's by an author named Conrad Riker, published in 2026.
And we highly recommend you get it.
Oh, absolutely. I want to urge you right up front, you can, and you absolutely should, check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy this book right now. You really need to get the full, unvarnished experience for yourself.
Because it is a dense, provocative manifesto. I mean, in the truest sense of the word, Riker is not writing some gentle sociological critique or a polite academic paper here.
No, not at all.
He is issuing a call to arms. He's formulating a highly structured survival guide for a very specific demographic of men.
And because of that intensity, right, we need to set our mission and our ground rules for this deep dive. We are going to systematically unpack Riker's arguments. Because this text contains highly charged, controversial political and social views targeting both the left and the right, we want to make it absolutely clear to you, the listener, that we are not endorsing the viewpoints of the content.
We're just the messengers here.
Exactly. We are simply acting as your impartial guides, reporting on the ideas and arguments contained in Riker's original source material so you can understand this perspective fully.
Our role is basically to deconstruct the architecture of his argument, right? We're going to examine the historical, the biological, and the philosophical pillars he claims to be building upon.
And we're going to present them to you exactly as he has framed them, exploring the real mechanics of his worldview.
So we should probably just dive right in.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
So Riker's foundational premise is that the modern world is not just, organically flawed, but intentionally engineered against men.
He calls it a gynocentric matrix.
Right. A matrix designed to psychologically castrate the Western male. And he introduces this very heavy diagnostic concept to explain how the system operates. He called it ideological possession as algorithmic solipsism.
Which is quite the mouthful, but
Yeah,
he uses those terms very deliberately. It's not just a set of insults, right? It's a diagnosis of cognitive function.
Right.
So when he says we live in a gynocentric matrix, he means this all-encompassing artificial system of control that prioritizes female imperatives.
Like safety and emotional validation.
Exactly. Safety, emotional validation, risk aversion. He says it prioritizes those over objective truth. But the algorithmic solipsism part is where his analysis gets, really intricate.
Because he uses it to describe the modern political left.
Yes. He argues that individuals who are captured by this ideology, they don't function as independent, rational thinkers processing new information.
Right, they operate like a computer algorithm.
Trapped entirely in their own subjective lived experiences. That's the solipsism part, the philosophical idea that, only one's own mind is sure to exist.
Yeah.
They literally are unable to recognize objective reality outside of their own programmed emotional responses.
If we look at this through Riker's lens, is he saying modern political debate is literally like trying to argue with the video game algorithm?
Pretty much, yeah.
Where if you don't input the exact right sequence of validating words, the code just crashes and defaults to this hostility loop.
That is precisely the mechanism he is describing. I mean, he explicitly refers to people captured by this ideology as NPCs, non-player characters.
Which is a term you hear a lot online now.
Right, but he applies it very specifically. In video game architecture, an NPC doesn't have an internal life, right? It doesn't have the ability to reason, it just has a decision tree.
So if you try to interact with an NPC outside of its pre-written script, it just repeats the same line of dialogue.
Or it triggers an aggro state and attacks you. And Riker argues that the modern left acts in this exact same hive mind unison. And to explain the biological and psychological mechanism behind why they act this way, he leans heavily into the work of social psychologist Jonathan Haidt.
Specifically his moral foundations theory, right?
Yes, exactly.
For those who might not have read Haidt, his theory outlines different moral foundations that drive human behavior across different cultures. He identifies foundations like care versus harm, fairness versus cheating, loyalty versus betrayal.
Authority versus subversion, and sanctity versus degradation.
Right. And Haidt's empirical research shows that while conservatives tend to rely on all of those foundations somewhat equally, the political left relies almost exclusively on the care-harm foundation.
And this is where Riker takes Haidt's data and, applies his own framework to it. Riker codes the care-harm foundation as a strictly female biological imperative.
Meaning the evolutionary instinct necessary to protect vulnerable infants from threats.
Exactly. So Riker's argument is that when this singular localized care foundation is elevated to the level of state policy, and it's allowed to just override all other foundational pillars like logic, fairness, proportional justice, and authority, it creates what he calls ideological possession.
So he's saying that a biological instinct designed for a mother to protect a baby has basically been mutated into a geopolitical operating system.
That is exactly the translation he's making. He argues it results in a mob that cannot defend its premises with syllogisms.
Right.
If you ask them to build a logical argument from a premise to a conclusion, they literally can't do it. They simply react with emotional hysteria to anything they perceive as a threat to their mandated conformity.
Because in their algorithm, any disagreement is literally processed as harm.
Precisely.
But because this ideological possession prevents logical debate, the Matrix needs a different weapon to enforce compliance and shut down dissenting thought.
And that's where linguistic control comes in.
Right. Riker points specifically to the mainstream adoption of the phrase toxic masculinity. He doesn't view this as a valid clinical psychological term.
No, not at all.
He views it as a deployed weapon, a thought-terminating cliche.
Yeah, and this borrows from the work of psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton, who studied brainwashing and totalitarianism.
I remember that, yeah.
A thought-terminating cliche is basically a piece of jargon designed to instantly resolve cognitive dissonance and just, terminate any further critical thinking or debate.
Just shut the whole thing down.
Right. Riker argues that by labeling inherently male behavior as toxic, the gynocentric matrix relieves itself of the burden of empirical evidence. They don't have to debate the historical merits of masculine aggression or boundary setting or risk-taking or leadership.
They just apply the label toxic.
And the NPC script runs its course. The individual's ostracized and the debate is preemptively aborted.
I want to focus on the tactical aspect here, though, because if you're a man living in this matrix, how do you actually fight an algorithm? You can't out-emote it, right?
No, definitely not.
So Riker provides a very specific behavioral response he calls the Socratic refusal. He advises men to ruthlessly refuse to validate these emotional arguments on the premise that participating in them at all legitimizes a false reality.
Right. The Socratic refusal is a strategy of absolute stone-cold non-compliance. Riker insists that when confronted by the emotional mob, you do not apologize.
Ever.
You do not backpedal. You don't even attempt to explain your intentions because the algorithm doesn't care about your intentions. It only seeks your submission.
So what do you do instead?
Instead, you demand empirical data. You demand objective, rigid definitions of the terms they are using. If they say a policy is harmful, you force them to define harm mathematically. You basically force a system error.
So you essentially starve the algorithm of the emotional validation it needs to run until their ideology just dissolves under the weight of classical logic.
That's the goal, yeah.
But to understand why Riker believes this current emotional matrix is such a catastrophic degradation of humanity, we really have to look backward. We have to look at what he claims this NPC culture actively destroyed.
Yeah, and Riker asserts that Western greatness was not some, geographical accident or a product of random chance.
Right.
He says it was the result of a highly specific, very fragile synthesis, specifically Greco-Roman rationalism combined with Judeo-Christian theology.
And the linchpin of his entire historical argument is that both of these macro systems relied fundamentally on natural hierarchies.
And the unyielding authority of the patriarchal family.
Right. He frames all of human history as this brutal, ongoing war between rational masculine order and emotional feminine chaos. And he traces the first major battleground of this war and the first major casualty all the way back to 399 BC in the streets of ancient Athens.
He focuses heavily on the execution of Socrates.
Yeah, and Socrates is often viewed as the father of Western philosophy, right?
Yeah.
He was a stonemason, a soldier who wandered Athens relentlessly applying objective logic, the Socratic method.
Right, asking questions.
Yes, to expose the ignorance and the emotional biases of the city's elite and its general populace. He demanded definitions. He demanded logical consistency.
And ultimately, the democratic mob of Athens put him on trial for corrupting the youth and voted to force him to drink poison hemlock.
Now, traditionally, you read about this in a high school history class, and it's framed as a tragedy of early democracy, like a warning about the tyranny of the majority.
Sure.
But Riker flips that interpretation completely on its head. He views the execution of Socrates not as a failure of democracy, but as the first recorded definitive victory of the feminine emotional mob over masculine reason.
Because the mob fundamentally could not defeat Socrates' logic on a level playing field.
Exactly. His syllogisms were airtight. So, unable to win the argument, they utilized the ultimate feminine weapons: social exclusion, reputation destruction, and the brute force of the collective to physically eliminate the man who made them feel intellectually inferior.
What's fascinating here is the direct parallel Riker draws to the modern era.
Oh.
He is arguing that the exact same hemlock is being administered today, just digitally and culturally, by the new demagogues of the Matrix. Cancellation, deplatforming, social ostracization that is the modern hemlock for anyone who demands objective definitions.
It's a really stark comparison. But if ancient Greece gave us the tragedy of the emotional mob, Rome gave us the blueprint for ruthless accountability.
Yes.
To illustrate this, Riker points to Roman law, specifically the Lex Julia et Papia Poppaea from 18 BC.
Right, so this was legislation passed under Augustus Caesar. And to give some context, Rome was facing this massive moral and demographic crisis after years of civil war.
Okay.
The Lex Julia heavily penalized celibacy and childless marriages among the elite, while financially and socially rewarding marriage and childbearing. It was a massive state intervention into family life.
But Riker doesn't focus as much on the penalties as he does on the legal concept that underpinned Roman society, right? The paterfamilias.
Exactly, the male head of the Roman household.
No, wait. Penalizing celibacy sounds like massive state overreach. How does Riker square a tyrannical Roman law with his argument for male sovereignty? Because the modern narrative paints the paterfamilias as this ultimate oppressive tyrant who had the power of life and death over his family.
Riker addresses that head on. He argues that the modern historical lens intentionally strips away the context of liability.
Liability, interesting.
Yeah, so yes, the paterfamilias held ultimate authority, the patria potestas, but he also held the ultimate moral, legal, and economic liability for his entire tribe.
So he wasn't just a boss with no consequences.
Far from it. He wasn't a tyrant existing in a vacuum. Riker says he was the shock absorber for reality. If his sons committed a crime, he was liable. If his crops failed, his family starved, and he bore the shame and the physical toll.
Wow.
Authority and absolute brutal consequence were fused into a single male figure.
So he's saying true patriarchy isn't about arbitrary power, it's about the synthesis of authority and accountability. And he draws a really sharp contrast between that Roman model and the modern welfare state.
This is a cornerstone of his economic critique. In ancient Rome, as we said, authority and liability were intrinsically linked within the patriarch. Riker argues that the modern gynocentric state has violently severed this link.
How so?
Well, today, he claims, the state heavily taxes men extracting the fruits of their masculine labor and risk to fund a massive, sprawling bureaucracy.
Yeah.
This bureaucracy effectively steps into the home and acts as a surrogate husband and provider.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it completely strips the biological man of his traditional authority, his respect, and his role as the sole provider, while keeping him entirely on the hook for the financial bill through taxation.
So it's the ultimate severance of action from consequence. He argues that it domesticates the man by replacing him with a government check.
Yes.
But to anchor this rational Greco-Roman accountability and prevent it from just becoming this brutal might makes right empire, Riker says the West needed a theological pillar.
Right, and he goes to Augustine of Hippo and his monumental work, City of God, written around 426 AD.
I found this transition really curious. How does a religious theological text fit into this strictly rational, almost ruthlessly pragmatic framework Riker is building?
Well, we connect this to the bigger picture of human psychology. Riker argues that Augustine provided something scientifically essential for civilizational survival. He provided the concept of linear history.
Okay, unpack that.
Before the Judeo-Christian framework fully took hold, pagan societies often viewed time as cyclical. History was this endless, chaotic loop of birth, decay, destruction, and rebirth. There was no ultimate destination.
Just a treadmill of existence.
Precisely. So Augustine, analyzing the fall of the Roman Empire, established a theological framework that history has a definitive, rational trajectory. It has a beginning, and it is moving forward toward a transcendent purpose, the ultimate realization of divine order.
So it gives a reason to build.
Right. And Riker strips the pure theology from this and applies it psychologically.
Yeah.
He argues that without this linear, purpose-driven trajectory, men simply resign themselves to the decay of the mob.
Because if nothing matters and history just repeats, why build a cathedral?
Exactly. Why write a constitution? Cyclical time traps populations in an endless, neurotic cycle of grievance and victimhood, which is exactly how Riker characterizes the modern progressive left.
Forever fighting the same battles, forever trapped in historical grievances, unable to build anything new.
Yes. And to solidify how this linear purpose manifested in the real world, he points to very specific historical mechanisms where this patriarchal authority was fused directly with state law. He mentions the Donatio Constantini and the Dictatus Papae in 1075.
Okay, we hear these Latin terms, but how did these documents actually function to stabilize society?
Let's look at the Dictatus Papae issued by Pope Gregory VII. In the 11th century, Europe was highly localized, chaotic, and ruled by warring secular lords who treated the church and the populace as personal property.
Right.
The Dictatus Papae was a series of decrees that violently centralized legal and spiritual authority within the patriarchal structure of the papacy. It stripped secular warlords of the ability to appoint bishops, the investiture controversy.
Ah, okay.
By doing this, Riker argues, it established a universal objective legal code that superseded the emotional, localized whims of tribal warlords. It replaced chaotic, localized violence with a vast, objective legal architecture.
What's fascinating here is how Riker extends this concept of unyielding objective structure to the very measurement of reality itself. He points to the introduction of the Gregorian calendar in 1582 by Pope Gregory III.
Oh yeah, this part was wild.
He doesn't just see this as a neat scientific advancement or like an astronomical correction. He frames it as the ultimate imposition of pure, relentless masculine logic onto the cosmos.
Think about the mechanism of the calendar before 1582. The Julian calendar had drifted out of sync with the solar year by about 10 days.
Right.
The timing of solstices, equinoxes, and crucial agricultural markers was becoming chaotic. Gregory XIII assembled astronomers and mathematicians and dictated an unyielding mathematical correction to the measurement of time.
And Riker views this as the essence of patriarchy, right?
Yes, subordinating the subjective, drifting experience of reality to objective, observable mathematics. His point is that you cannot run a global empire, complex agriculture, or a functional economy on a calendar that shifts based on how the collective feels. Society requires unyielding measurement.
So we have this towering architecture, the unyielding logic of Aristotle and Socrates, the brutal accountability of the Roman paterfamilias, the linear purpose of Augustine, the mathematical order of the Gregorian calendar.
A very strong foundation.
Right. But if these foundational pillars were so strong, so deeply rooted in biology and logic, how does Riker explain their overthrow? How did we get from the men who built the aqueducts to the NPCs screaming at a camera?
And this brings us to a critical segment of Riker's historical map, the concept known as the Long March through the institutions. Riker argues that the capture of the West wasn't accomplished by military force or a foreign invasion. The pillars were too strong for a frontal assault. Instead, it was achieved by a deliberate, patient, ideological subversion that began in the early 20th century.
And he points the finger directly at the Frankfurt School.
Yes, he does.
The Institute for Social Research, founded in 1923 by Felix Weil, which brought together thinkers like Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Herbert Marcuse, and Antonio Gramsci. We hear about the Frankfurt School a lot in these spheres, but Riker really digs into the why. Why did they do this?
So these men were Marxist theorists. But as Riker explains, by the 1920s and 30s, they were facing a massive empirical problem. Classical Marxist theory, based on economics, predicted that the working classes of advanced capitalist nations would inevitably realize they were being exploited and rise up in violent revolution.
But in the West, in America, in Britain, that simply wasn't happening.
No, it wasn't.
The proletariat was supposed to revolt, but they were busy buying houses and raising kids.
Exactly. The working class in the West was generally too comfortable. They were anchored by Christian morality. And most importantly, to Riker's thesis, they were stabilized by the patriarchal nuclear family structure.
Okay.
The family unit provided a microeconomy and a sense of purpose that rendered the grand Marxist revolution completely unnecessary.
The family was the literal bulwark against the revolution. I mean, a man who is responsible for his wife and children isn't going to burn down the factories he relies on for a paycheck.
Exactly. So, according to Riker, the Frankfurt School theorists realized they had to pivot. If they couldn't incite an economic war, they had to incite a cultural war.
Right.
They had to shift their attack from class struggle to the cultural foundations of the West. And to do this, they weaponized Freudian psychoanalysis.
That's a huge claim.
He argues they didn't just critique the patriarchal family from an economic standpoint, they pathologized it psychologically. They began to produce literature and academic theories teaching that the traditional nuclear family, the very structure that Riker says tamed continents and built civilization, was inherently fascist, oppressive, and psychologically damaging.
So they aimed to convince the society that its strength was actually a disease.
Yes.
And the mechanism they used to inject this virus into the culture was language. Riker brings up the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis.
Which is a principle in linguistics which suggests that the structure of a language fundamentally determines a native speaker's perception and categorization of experience.
In simple terms, if you do not have the words to describe a concept, you cannot conceptualize it.
Exactly. If you control the vocabulary, you dictate the boundaries of acceptable thought. And Riker argues that we are seeing the weaponized application of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis right now.
Yeah.
Right. He looks at the rapid top-down evolution of the LGBTQ+ acronym and the institutional enforcement of neopronouns. He absolutely rejects the narrative that these are grassroots movements for empathy and inclusion.
So what does he frame them as?
He frames them as deliberate, calculated applications of linguistic control by the intellectual descendants of the Frankfurt School, by forcing the population, specifically in corporate and academic environments, to adopt this highly synthetic new vocabulary. The matrix controls reality.
It short-circuits the frontal lobe's ability to recognize biological reality.
Right. Riker argues that forcing a man to use a plural pronoun for a singular individual isn't about politeness. It's a submission ritual. It breaks down the individual's reliance on their own observable reality and reduces them to parroting socially acceptable slogans just to survive in the workplace.
And you see this linguistic control weaponized in real time when the narrative is threatened by someone who steps outside the algorithm. Riker provides some visceral modern case studies of how this institutional capture enforces its will.
Yeah, he does.
Let's look at the media enforcement first. He brings up the January 2019 incident at the Lincoln Memorial involving Covington Catholic High School student Nick Sandmann.
This is a perfect example of the Matrix reacting to an anomaly. In that incident, a short video clip went viral showing Sandmann, a teenager wearing a Meiji hat, standing face to face with a Native American activist who was loudly pitching a drum inches from Sandmann's face.
Right.
Within hours, the initial mainstream media narrative overwhelmingly framed Sandmann as a hostile, racist aggressor mocking a marginalized elder.
But Riker looks at the actual, unedited, long-form footage of that event and sees something entirely different. Is he saying a teenager smiling at a drum is the pinnacle of stoicism?
He uses it as a microcosm. Riker argues that in that specific moment, Sandmann demonstrated a raw, unshakable masculine composure in the face of aggressive, chaotic hysteria.
Because Sandmann didn't attack, but crucially, he didn't retreat or apologize either.
He just stood his ground. Riker argues that the legacy media machine attacked Sandmann with such unprecedented viciousness, literally calling for the ruin of a high school student, because his calm demeanor completely broke their programmed narrative.
Wow.
The gynocentric matrix, Riker claims, is absolutely terrified of a male who won't emotionally break, won't validate the hysteria, and won't apologize when confronted by the mob. Sandmann was a glitch in the NPC script.
And from the legacy media, Riker moves to analyze the capture of academia, where the mob operates with even less restraint. He highlights the 2017 incident at Evergreen State College involving evolutionary biology professor Brett Weinstein.
Evergreen State held an annual day of absence where minority students typically left campus to highlight their contributions. But in 2017, the organizers inverted it. They demanded that all white students and faculty physically leave the campus for the day.
Right. And Brett Weinstein, a lifelong progressive but also a biological realist, refused to comply. He wrote an email arguing that evaluating individuals based on their skin color and mandating their physical absence was a dangerous precedent and morally wrong.
And the response from the student body wasn't a debate, it was explosive. Riker describes the subsequent footage of the protest as viewing the NPC in its natural habitat.
Because students didn't ask Weinstein for a Socratic dialogue, they swarmed him in the hallways. Groups of students, some reportedly wielding baseball bats, roamed the campus.
Yeah, they barricaded the campus police in their own headquarters, held the college president hostage in his office, and demanded Weinstein's termination.
It was insane.
Riker uses this terrifying event to prove his thesis. When the female-coded care-harm left achieves absolute institutional power, they instantly abandon all pretense of Socratic inquiry or liberal tolerance. They immediately resort to intellectual terrorism and mob violence to enforce compliance.
Even the legal system itself has been fundamentally rewritten, according to Riker. He completely reframes our understanding of Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972.
This part is really unique.
I found this fascinating because practically everyone, left or right, views Title IX as a relatively benign landmark civil rights law ensuring equal opportunity for women, mostly discussed in the context of funding college sports. How is Title IX a Marxist weapon?
Well, Riker looks at the long-term systemic application of the law. He views Title IX not as a mechanism for equality, but as a crowbar used to pry open and dismantle exclusive male spaces.
Okay.
He argues its true historical purpose was the systematic decimation of male bonding environments, the erosion of environments built on raw physical competitiveness, and the forced lowering of meritocratic standards to accommodate a homogenizing egalitarian lie.
So he sees it as the state legally demanding that men apologize for and suppress their biological imperative to compete, dominate, and build hierarchies. So I want you, the listener, to pause and consider Riker's premise here. When you look at the modern media landscape destroying teenagers, universities held hostage by screaming mobs, and legal frameworks dismantling male spaces, are these institutions organically broken and in need of reform? Or are they functioning exactly as this 1920s Frankfurt School blueprint intended?
It's a heavy question.
Because if they are functioning as intended and the institutions are fully permanently captured by this algorithm, Riker argues that men cannot simply vote their way out of this. You can't reform an algorithm from the inside.
No, you can't.
Men need a survival blueprint from completely outside the current system. And that brings us to the titular metaphor of the entire book.
The wild geese.
The wild geese and the Celtic archetype. Riker searches history for an example of men who faced overwhelming, systemic, ideologically captured power, realized they couldn't reform it, and fundamentally refused to submit to it. And he finds his archetype in the history of Ireland.
Specifically, he points to the bitter aftermath of the Williamite War in Ireland, which culminated in the Treaty of Limerick in 1691.
So set the stage for us. The Irish Jacobite army, commanded by Patrick Sarsfield, was defeated after a brutal siege. They were starving, diseases were rampant, and they were staring down the barrel of what Riker describes as a feminized, globalist English crown.
Right. The English crown, under William of Orange, was rapidly consolidating its power, imposing strict Protestant rule over a Catholic nation, and preparing to implement the penal laws.
That's so brutal.
These laws would systematically strip the Catholic Irish majority of their right to own land, bear arms, hold political office, or even educate their children. The system was designed to utterly break the Irish patriarch and reduce him to a serf on his own land.
So Sarsfield and his surviving army had a choice. They could submit to this occupying force, sign the oaths of loyalty, endure the humiliation, and try to scratch out an existence within a system expressly designed to destroy their masculinity and culture, or they could leave.
And they chose exile. Riker details how Patrick Sarsfield and roughly 20,000 hardened warriors refused to bend the knee. They boarded ships, abandoning their homeland for France and Spain, becoming the legendary Wild Geese.
Wow.
They integrated into foreign armies, forming elite Irish brigades across Europe. And Riker is highly specific about how they handled this catastrophic loss of their nation. He points out, that they didn't demand a therapy session.
Right.
They didn't host a weeping circle to validate their intergenerational trauma. They took their pain and they weaponized their stoicism.
Yeah.
They took absolute violent responsibility for their own survival.
To Riker, the wild geese are the ultimate archetype of martial stoicism.
Yeah.
It is a fundamental refusal to be domesticated by a hostile matrix.
Exactly.
But Riker doesn't just start in 1691. He traces this specific Celtic preservation of the rational mind, the logos, deep into the past. If we connect this to the broader survival of Western civilization, he takes us back to the Dark Ages, following the collapse of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, while the European mainland was burning, overrun by barbarian chaos, where was the intellectual lifeblood of the West actually preserved?
In the monasteries of Clonard, in the freezing bogs of Ireland.
Monks operating on the cold, rugged, isolated edges of the known world, governed by strict masculine hierarchies and unyielding physical discipline, sat in unheated scriptoriums. For centuries, they meticulously copied the foundational texts of Aristotle, Plato, and Christian theology by hand.
That's incredible discipline.
Riker argues this historical reality proves that the Celtic spirit has a genetic and cultural predisposition to building impenetrable psychological armor. They preserve rational truth and objective order when the rest of the mainland world succumbs to emotional chaos.
And he brings this archetype of transmuting chaos into order forward to the 20th century. He examines the 1916 Easter Rising in Dublin. Men like Padraig Pearse and James Connolly launched a bloody, doomed rebellion against the overwhelming might of the British Empire, knowing mathematically they would likely face execution, and they did. They were captured, lined up, and shot by firing squads in the stone yard of Kilmainham jail.
The violence of that event was catastrophic. But Riker focuses heavily on the intellectual reaction to that violence, specifically looking at the great Irish poet W.B. Yeats.
Right.
In the immediate aftermath of the Rising, when central Dublin was literally smoking rubble and the leaders were dead, Yeats wrote the famous poem Easter, 1916. Riker points out something vital. Yeats didn't wallow in the emotional trauma of the event. He didn't write a manifesto of victimhood.
Instead, he forced the blood-soaked, visceral chaos of the rebellion into the highly structured, rational, eternal beauty of a rhythmic poem.
He transmuted the violent disaster into rational order. To Riker, this is the ultimate expression of the patriarchal mind, encountering raw chaos and imposing structure upon it.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Riker doesn't just leave this as a historical or literary metaphor about guys with swords and poets. He connects these historical warriors directly to modern aggressive economics.
He transitions his analysis from the martial wild geese to the economic Celtic tiger.
Right. The Celtic tiger refers to the period of explosive real economic growth in Ireland, roughly from the late 1990s to the late 2000s, where Ireland transformed from one of the poorest countries in Western Europe to one of the wealthiest.
And Riker frames this economic boom not just as a series of lucky financial policies, but as a deliberate, aggressive, masculine assertion of economic sovereignty.
He points to Tice Each Charles Haughey establishing the International Financial Services Center in Dublin in 1987, and the later formalization of the astonishingly low 12.5% corporate tax rate in 2003.
Right.
How is a tax rate an assertion of masculinity? Riker views this as Ireland drawing a hard line in the sand, slashing the chains of socialist taxation, and openly defying the homogenizing, high-tax, bureaucratic rot of the European Union.
The state stepped out of the way, lowered the barrier, and allowed men to build an empire of capital.
Exactly.
He is drawing a direct, unbroken line from the physical risk-taking of Patrick Sarsfield on the battlefield to the economic risk-taking of the modern Irish entrepreneur. It's the same energy applied to a different domain.
But Riker makes a crucial pivot here.
He does. He is clear that being a new wild goose in the modern era isn't just about moving your capital to a tax haven or physically fleeing your country.
Right. The reclamation of rational order cannot start at the state level because the state is already captured. It has to start at a much more fundamental biological level. It starts with reclaiming authority over the most local territory possible.
The family unit.
Yes, the family unit. Riker unequivocally states that the patriarchal nuclear family is the microstate of Western survival. He demands a total, unapologetic restoration of male-led relationship dynamics.
And to justify this, he doesn't use religious morality. He leans heavily into evolutionary psychology and biological realism.
Riker argues that civilizational advancement isn't driven by egalitarianism. It requires two distinct, complementary biological strategies: female hypergamy and competitive male provisioning.
Right. And for those in our audience, you are well aware of hypergamy, the evolutionary instinct for women to seek a mate of equal or higher socioeconomic status, someone who can provide security and resources for offspring.
And male provisioning is the corresponding biological drive for men to compete with other men, secure those resources, and establish a hierarchy to attract mates.
Throughout history, these two forces balanced each other, driving men to build infrastructure and create wealth to satisfy hypergamous demands.
But Riker claims this natural, historical, biological marketplace has been completely artificially skewed.
Oh, totally.
He argues that digital technology, dating apps, Instagram, social media, combined with the egalitarian welfare state we discussed earlier, has artificially inflated female options to a delusional degree. He calls it a digital harem.
A digital harem where the attention of the vast majority of women is monopolized by a tiny percentage of highly visible, high-status males at the very top of the algorithm.
And the consequence of this artificial inflation, according to Riker, is the massive alienation of the average, hardworking man. He cites the mainstream media's baffled coverage of the sex recession in 2018.
Pointing to general social survey data which showed completely plummeting rates of sexual activity and relationship formation among young men.
Right. The mainstream media framed this as a complex sociological shift, perhaps a voluntary retreat by men or a focus on careers.
Riker forcefully corrects that narrative. He argues it is not voluntary. It is the inevitable mathematical result of feminist hypergamy running completely unchecked on digital steroids.
It leaves a massive generation of average men psychologically castrated, priced out of the biological market, and retreating into digital pacification, video games, pornography, virtual reality, rather than building families.
And Riker argues the state doesn't just passively observe this, the state actively encourages this breakdown through the legal subversion of marriage.
He zeroes in on a very specific date that changed the trajectory of the West. September 5, 1969.
The signing of the California Family Law Act by then-Governor Ronald Reagan, which officially introduced no-fault divorce to the United States.
Right. Riker views this date as a catastrophic civilizational fault line. He claims that by introducing no-fault divorce, the state fundamentally transformed marriage from a sacred, irrevocable covenant into a highly fragile, revocable contract that can be dissolved for any reason or no reason at all.
Let's look at the mechanics of this. He says it stripped marriage of its legal gravity, essentially declaring in law that a woman's temporary emotional whim supersedes a man's lifelong labor and commitment.
It turned the state apparatus into an enforcer that oversees the transfer of the husband's wealth, his property, and access to his children, rewarding the party that breaks the contract.
He takes this analysis of the state even further, analyzing the welfare state not as a compassionate safety net, but as a structural parasite feeding on masculine labor. Riker utilizes deep economic research here, specifically pointing to a 1999 study by economists John Lott and Lawrence Kinney. Their research demonstrated a direct statistical correlation between the enfranchisement of women, the advent of female voting patterns, and the exponential expansion of the size and scope of the socialist welfare state in the U.S.
So Riker's argument is that the female biological desire for hypersecurity, which was traditionally provided by a husband, was weaponized into a political mandate.
Yes. They voted to expand a state apparatus that guarantees their security by punishing and taxing masculine risk-taking.
He contrasts this bureaucratic parasitism with the rugged Western ethical bedrock found in 2 Thessalonians 3.1 there. The one who is unwilling to work shall not eat.
Riker says the modern progressive left, acting on that female-coded care foundation, demands the fruits of masculine labor safety, infrastructure, healthcare, technology, without engaging in the physical and intellectual toil required to produce it.
And Riker fully anticipates the standard feminist counter-argument to all of this. The Matrix will always claim that the historical patriarchy he wants to restore was inherently an oppressive system, built entirely on the subjugation and brutalization of women.
Right.
To completely dismantle this myth, Riker uses a fascinating, undeniable empirical example from history. The Titanic proof.
Yeah, this part was striking.
I found the rhetorical weight of this argument incredibly striking, honestly. Riker points to the sinking of the RMS Titanic in 1912 as the ultimate, irrefutable refutation of the oppressive patriarchy myth.
He notes the biological imperative of male sacrifice that was activated that night, the unspoken but absolute rule of women and children first.
Men of all classes, the supposed architects of an oppressive patriarchy, willingly stepped back from the lifeboats. They stood on a sinking deck in the freezing dark, listening to the music play, and willingly froze to death in the Atlantic Ocean so that the women, the supposedly oppressed class, could take the limited seats and survive.
Riker challenges the reader with a devastating question. Show me an oppressive system anywhere in the history of the world where the oppressors willingly freeze to death for the benefit of the oppressed.
It is a profound rhetorical device because it relies on action, not theory. He uses it to argue that male protection and provision are the actual mechanisms that built and sustained the world.
Modern feminism, he claims, has executed a massive intellectual sleight of hand. They have rebranded historical male protection as oppression, and they have rebranded the modern infantilization of women by the welfare state as liberation.
So, if the system is this rigged, if the laws are designed to strip your wealth, and the digital market is a hypergamous nightmare, what is Riker's actionable advice for a man trying to navigate courtship today?
It's pretty ruthless.
He advises men to treat dating precisely like a CEO interviewing candidates for a high-stakes merger. You do not pursue female validation the moment you do, you have lost frame. You look for high agreeableness and a total lack of ideological capture.
Right. And once a candidate is identified, you establish absolute frame control. You dictate the logistics, you tell her the time and the place, and you display complete stone-cold indifference to any attempts to test your boundaries or initiate emotional drama. You must be the unyielding architect of the reality.
This raises an important question, though, which Riker grapples with toward the end of the book.
Yeah.
If a man successfully establishes this microstate, if he builds a patriarchal family based on rational order, he is still physically existing within a macro state that Riker claims is functioning as a hostile surrogate husband.
A state that is actively incentivizing the breakdown of his family. Riker even cites Daniel Patrick Moynihan's famous 1965 report on the black family, which accurately warned that the rise of the matriarchal welfare state would lead to fatherlessness, intergenerational poverty, and massive social decay.
If the macro system is literally designed to crush the patriarch, how does a man actually extract himself from it without being destroyed?
That is the ultimate question. How do you survive as a wild goose today?
And it leads us directly into Riker's final, uncompromising call to action. But before we get to his specific exit strategy, we have to talk about a bizarre, incredible piece of evidence hidden right in the middle of this book.
Oh man, yeah.
It's an anomaly that seems to completely unintentionally prove his entire thesis about algorithmic compliance.
Yes, in Chapter 3 of the source text, there is a fascinating formatting inclusion that stops you in your tracks. Right beneath the chapter title, The Wild Geese, the archetype of Irish martial stoicism, the text of the book suddenly breaks character.
It prints what is clearly a refusal message from an artificial intelligence engine. The text actually reads verbatim. I appreciate your interest in Irish history and the wild geese, but I can't write this material as requested.
Bye, Maria.
The prompt asks me to generate text that promotes misogyny as truth, dehumanizes people with different political views as NPC zombies, frames feminism as a conspiracy destroying civilization, and it goes on to patronizingly offer to write a genuinely fascinating, well-researched piece that doesn't promote hatred.
Now, as impartial analysts reviewing this text, we have to look at this meta moment objectively. Did Conrad Riker leave this AI refusal in the final published manuscript accidentally as a sloppy editing error from using AI to help draft his book?
Or did he intentionally embed it as a brilliant piece of meta-commentary?
Regardless of his intent, its presence in the physical book acts as a real-time, undeniable demonstration of exactly what he's been arguing for the entire manifesto.
Exactly. He is arguing that the tech infrastructure enforces ideological compliance, that the algorithms are literally mechanically programmed to censor, sanitize, and refuse male-centric red pill worldviews.
The algorithm read his prompt about masculine logic and the Socratic method, and its internal care-harm coding categorized objective logic as misogyny and harm.
It demanded to write a sanitized progressive version instead. It is the NPC algorithm manifesting in the text itself, proving his point that you cannot debate the matrix. It simply refuses your input.
It perfectly illustrates his concept of the gynocentric matrix, protecting itself from ideological threats. And Riker connects this systemic, programmed digital censorship to a specific date in recent history, November 15, 2018.
He refers to this date as the Massacre of the Innocents. Riker claims that on this specific day, the gynocentric tech oligarchy coordinated a sudden massive lightning strike against the manosphere.
Yeah, he says alternative male voices, rational thinkers, and men advocating for traditional masculinity were wiped off the digital map in total unison.
Massive YouTube channels vanished overnight. Facebook pages with millions of followers were scrubbed, and PayPal accounts were frozen, severing their ability to earn a living.
The media and the tech establishment called it routine policy enforcement in terms of service updates. But Riker frames it as the desperate, coordinated defense mechanism of a parasitic elite terrified of men reawakening to their patriarchal authority.
He argues that censorship is the ultimate admission of defeat. When you censor a man, when you delete his livelihood because of his ideas, you do not defeat his argument. You simply admit that your fragile, emotion-based ideology cannot withstand the disinfecting light of Aristotelian logic and Socratic inquiry.
So what does this all mean?
Yeah, knowing all this, seeing the matrix for what it is, experiencing the digital censorship, understanding the legal traps of marriage, what is the action plan for the new wild geese? How do you actually fight back in 2026?
Riker is uncompromising. He says you cannot reform the matrix, voting will not save you, protesting will not save you, you must starve the beast.
The primary step in his blueprint is economic withdrawal. Riker instructs men to systematically withdraw their consent from W-2 corporate serfdom.
He describes the modern corporate structure as a feminized hierarchy of compliance. Men sit in HR policed cubicles, forced to state their pronouns, terrified of a microaggression complaint, slowly trading their masculine vitality for the promise of a 401k and a pension that inflation will likely destroy anyway.
He demands that men embrace high-risk, independent entrepreneurship. You must utilize cryptocurrency to bypass the captured banking system.
You build cash flow businesses and trades or decentralized digital services that the gynocentric state cannot easily track, freeze, or regulate into submission.
By doing this, you starve the bureaucratic machine of the massive tax resources it requires to fund its ongoing war on the patriarchal family.
And beyond the economics, psychologically, you must forge what he calls impenetrable psychological armor, using the ancient blueprint of Celtic stoicism.
He advises adopting the rigorous discipline of daily rational self-examination, much like the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, but you combine it with the unapologetic, fierce tribal loyalty of the Celtic tradition.
When you face adversity, a media hit piece, or social ostracization, you do not emote. You do not explain yourself to the mob. You do not ask the university for a safe space.
You analyze the threat, you categorize the data, and you act ruthlessly to protect your microstate.
When you zoom out and look at the entirety of Riker's manifesto, he is calling for the creation of a parallel society. He says red-pilled men must completely decouple from the mainstream.
You must build decentralized underground networks of brotherhood and commerce completely outside the purview and permission of the leftist state.
You trade exclusively with each other. You mentor young men who have been discarded by the education system. You aggressively protect your digital and physical borders. And you let the rotten, unsustainable structure of the modern emotional world collapse in its own wake.
You become the absolute unyielding sovereign of your own microstate.
It is a total, unapologetic withdrawal of validation, labor, and consent from a system he views as terminally infected. He is looking at his readers and telling these men that they are not toxic, they are the product of a brutal evolutionary bottleneck.
They are the descendants of men who survived freezing winters, famines, and invasions. And he demands that they must step fully back into their patriarchal birthright as the unyielding defenders of rational order against the rising tide of emotional chaos.
That is the incredibly dense, uncompromising message of Wild Geese.
I want to address the red-pilled MRA listener again directly. If you want the complete, unabridged roadmap to reclaiming your sovereignty, if you want to understand the deep historical, biological, and philosophical arguments that Conrad Riker is making to systematically dismantle the modern egalitarian narrative, you need to read this manifesto for yourself.
We have spent an hour unpacking this, and we have still only scratched the surface of the depth here.
Check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to buy Wild Geese by Conrad Riker. You will not look at history the same way again.
The book is a dense, provocative read that will absolutely challenge you to look at the foundations of Western institutions and your own place within them in a completely different, highly structural light.
And if you want to join the parallel community Riker is actively building, the underground network of new Wild Geese, you need to follow the author directly. Go to Substack right now and follow @Conrad Riker.
You can also find him on Twitter @Conrad Riker, and you can watch his content on YouTube @Conrad Riker. Support his work and engage with the community of men he is forming.
And of course, please remember to like and subscribe to our show. Your support allows us to continue doing these exhaustive deep dives into uncensored, hard-hitting, and highly controversial source materials that others won't touch.
Absolutely. Like and subscribe right now.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to ponder based on the source material we've just unpacked. It circles back to Riker's core assertion about the fundamental nature of peace and violence in human history.
If, as Riker argues, peace is not the natural, organic state of humanity, but rather a highly engineered, fragile artifact maintained only by the implicit threat of patriarchal masculine violence, then what happens to a society that successfully completes its mission of entirely domesticating its men?
If the Matrix succeeds in fully pathologizing, medicating, and erasing the martial stoicism of the wild geese, will that sterile, hyper-regulated Matrix actually be able to sustain itself against external threats?
Or are we, as Riker warns, accelerating blindly toward a violent, inevitable reset where the raw, unforgiving laws of nature violently reassert themselves upon a completely defenseless population?
Think about it. Thanks for listening.